Earlier, I shared some stats about sort of legal equality, and I think the idea now is really to focus on stepping aside from legal equality, more focused on social and economic issues. And so, stemming off of what sexual orientation and gender identity. So this is where folks in same-sex couples live all over the country. You see some bright spots, right? The dark blue is a higher density proportion of same-sex couples per other households. But we're all over, and I think that is one stereotype that we need to push against, is that we only live in big cities, that we only live on the coasts, that we don't live in the South, for example. But what's also really interesting is when you look at the racial and ethnic diversity of our communities, LGBT people and same-sex couples live in communities. So this is where African American people and same-sex couples live. Now, this might be surprising to you, but if I overlaid a map of where African American people in this country live, this is the map. And the takeaway here is that if you want to serve African American same-sex couples, you actually have to go to where African American people live, right? You can't do it necessarily on the north side of Chicago, although maybe you can, but maybe you need to go to the south side of Chicago. If you want to be serving couples, you need to be going to the south, for example. And I think that this is an important frame to bring to our work, because it goes to important resources and funding are and the issues that we're working on. So same individuals and same-sex couples live. Again, overlay a map of where Latino people in the United States live. You see sort of the Southwest, New York, and then Florida, as Richard certainly talked about, South Florida. So what do we know about LGBT people and same-sex couples in terms of key disparities that are less about sort of legal access to rights, but are certainly influenced by that? So as I shared earlier, we know high rates of economic insecurity and unemployment. For trans people, for example, the unemployment rate, according to the National Transgender Discrimination Survey, was twice that of the general population. We know that access to healthcare and physical and mental health outcomes that there are huge disparities in terms of mental health, physical health, whether it's access to a regular physician, whether it's your quality of health, whether you say you're in great health or poor health. And I think that many of these issues are people on this panel are working on, and so they can certainly share why some of this is the case. I really would just want to focus on what stats we do have. We know that LGBT people report experiences of discrimination in virtually every area of life, whether it's employment, housing, it's accessing a physician, it is violence that we have seen most recently, obviously showcased in Orlando, but I would say the violence that we saw in Orlando is something that happens to LGBT people every single day, right? Mary referenced earlier the rates of murder among Black trans women in particular. But if you look at data from, for example, the Anti-Violence Project in New York, LGBT people of color, trans people of color in particular, experience incredibly high rates of hate violence. And so I think it's important for us to recognize that. And as I pointed to earlier, some of the data around systems involvement, both child welfare and juvenile and criminal justice systems. And I think that when we talk about social and economic issues, those are huge predictors of justice system involvement. And so while we can certainly talk about laws and policies, whether it's mass incarceration or drug laws or school to prison pipeline issues, we also know that homeless people are more likely to end up in prison or jail. We know that people with mental illness are more likely to end up in prison and jail. And so I think it's important to think about the places where people here are working and how that impacts some of these bottom line disparities that we see. So if we just take a step back and think about LGBT youth, and I know that Abbe is probably going to focus a bit more on this point, but LGBT youth in schools have a really hard time. And so this was a really interesting study that was actually nationally representative data, which we very rarely have about LGBT people, and it found that over 5 years, LGBT youth were 91% more likely to be bullied and 46% more likely to be bullied than their heterosexually identified peers. So school is not an awesome place for LGBT youth, whether it's bullying from their peers, whether it's violence from their peers, whether it's discrimination by staff, whether it's ultimately the school to prison pipeline, as we mentioned earlier. And what impact does education have on someone's long-term ability to graduate from high school, to find a job, to be healthy, to avoid many of these negative outcomes? And I think that that's something Abby's probably also going to talk about. Also, once LGBT youth are involved in systems, we know they have a hard time in many of these systems. So this was a study that came out quite a while ago, but it surveyed lesbian and gay youth in New York City's foster system and found that many of them actually leave the system. They run away, they are living on the streets because it's just not a safe place for them. So even systems that are designed to catch youth and to support them don't do that. And so they end up on the streets, and then there's a whole cascade of things that can happen from there. And the other community that I wanted to spend a little more time on than we did in the last panel is the transgender community. And I think that in many ways, we actually have more data about the trans community now than we have about the LGBT community or LGB community, in part because of the National Transgender Discrimination Survey that came out probably 5 years ago at this point. They actually redid it this summer. It's called the US Trans Survey. And data is supposed to be coming out this fall, and I cannot wait because they had, I think, 3 or 4 times the number of respondents. So it will be huge. It's not nationally representative, although there are some efforts underway to apply some sampling measures to help it be so. But from that survey, we found the analyses found incredibly high rates of harassment and discrimination. The fact that 3/4 of respondents were experienced harassment, discrimination, or mistreatment on the job, that is more than 3/4 of people. This is clearly not something that can continue. And then when you look at who had these experiences, you find that it's people who have then been homeless, who have been incarcerated, these experiences are all bound up together. And I think that that's the other takeaway that I'd like for folks to get from this data is that legal equality and legal protections are so bound up in the social experience, and they go back and forth. And I think it's so important that we think about them not as silos. And then this is a homelessness stat about trans people. So 19% in red of transgender people reported being homeless at some point. But then you see 41% of African American trans people and the other breakdowns versus race. And what I think is really interesting, as was mentioned on the earlier panel, is I think the extent to which many organizations and advocates in the movement are trying to think about how identities fit together. And as Mary said, we aren't one LGBT community. And so there is work happening in the LGBT movement that I am aware of, for example, on all of these issues. So the intersections of sexual orientation and race and ethnicity, language, national origin, ability, and class. There are many more topics we could add in here, but I think that organizations are realizing that people lead complicated and diverse lives, and that we as a movement have to recognize that. I will stop